The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Castle Aldermere as Sir Marcus Thornfield adjusted his ceremonial armor for what he believed would be another routine day guarding the royal family of Valethorn. 23 years of faithful service had taught him to read the moods of the castle like weather patterns, and today felt different. There was an electric tension in the air that made the hair on his neck stand on end. Marcus had been born into service, his father before him a guard to the previous king, and his grandfather before that. The Thornfield name was synonymous with unwavering loyalty to the crown. His weathered hands, scarred from countless training sessions and 2 border skirmishes, gripped his ceremonial rifle with practiced ease. At 45, he was no longer the young soldier who had once dreamed of glorious battles, but a man who had learned that true honor often lay in the quiet moments of protection rather than grand gestures of heroism. The castle itself seemed to breathe with ancient secrets. Built 3 centuries ago by King Aldrich the Bold, its stone walls had witnessed coronations, assassinations, births, deaths, and countless moments that shaped the kingdom of Valethorn. Marcus knew every corridor, every hidden passage, every creaking floorboard. He had memorized the daily routines of every member of the royal household, from the youngest scullery maid to the oldest advisor. This knowledge was not just professional necessity but a source of deep pride for a man who took his duty as protector seriously. Queen Isabel Vex had married into the royal family 5 years ago, bringing with her a dowry that had saved the kingdom from economic ruin but also a temperament that made the castle staff walk on eggshells. She was beautiful in the way that marble statues were beautiful, cold, perfect, and somehow untouchable. Her steel-gray eyes missed nothing, and her sharp tongue could reduce grown men to stammering children. The king, Edmund Valethorn, had married her out of political necessity rather than love, and it showed in every interaction between them. Their son, Prince Oliver, was 7 years old and possessed the kind of innocent joy that children of his age should have. He had his father's kind brown eyes and his mother's sharp intelligence, but, unlike his mother, he wore his emotions openly. Oliver laughed easily, cried when hurt, and trusted the adults around him completely. Marcus had watched the boy grow from a toddling infant into a curious, energetic child who asked endless questions about everything from sword fighting to why birds could fly but people couldn't. The prince had developed a particular fondness for Marcus, often seeking him out during his lessons to share some new discovery or ask about the guard's life before the castle. These moments were precious to Marcus, reminding him of the nephew he rarely saw, living in a distant village with his sister's family. Oliver represented everything good and pure that Marcus had sworn to protect when he first donned the royal uniform. Today was different because Queen Isabel had been particularly sharp with the staff all morning. The cook had fled the kitchens in tears after being berated for using too much salt in the breakfast porridge. The head chambermaid had been dismissed for the day after accidentally moving one of the Queen's jewelry boxes. Even the normally unflappable butler, Lord Ashford, seemed nervous as he went about his duties. Marcus had noticed these patterns before. The Queen's moods seemed to follow cycles, influenced by letters from her family's kingdom, changes in the political climate, or sometimes nothing discernible at all. On these days, everyone in the castle became hyper-vigilant, trying to anticipate and avoid whatever might trigger her displeasure. The king, for his part, often retreated to his study or found urgent business that required his attention elsewhere in the kingdom. As Marcus took his position outside the royal quarters, he could hear the sound of Prince Oliver's lessons beginning in the morning room. The boy's tutor, Master Benedict, was a patient man in his 60s who had taught 3 generations of royal children. His voice carried through the thick wooden doors as he led Oliver through his arithmetic exercises, the prince's young voice confidently reciting multiplication tables. The peaceful sound of learning was interrupted by the sharp click of heels on marble. Queen Isabel emerged from her chambers, dressed in a gown of deep burgundy silk that rustled with each step. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, followed at a respectful distance, her arms full of correspondence that required the Queen's attention. Marcus straightened to attention, offering the slight bow that protocol demanded when the Queen passed. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respect of decades of service. Queen Isabel barely acknowledged him, her attention focused on the letters in Sarah's arms. Her face was set in the expression that Marcus had learned to recognize as dangerous calm before the storm. Something in those letters had displeased her greatly. Her jaw was tight, and a small vein in her temple pulsed with barely controlled tension. As the Queen swept past toward the morning room where Oliver continued his lessons, Marcus felt a cold premonition settle in his stomach. He had seen this combination before. The Queen's volatile mood meeting the prince's innocent exuberance rarely ended well. Usually, it resulted in harsh words, cancelled privileges, or long lectures about proper royal behavior. But today felt different, charged with an intensity that made Marcus's veteran instincts scream warnings. The castle around them seemed to hold its breath. Servants found excuses to hurry past rather than linger in the corridors. The usual morning bustle became muted, everyone unconsciously lowering their voices and softening their footsteps. Even the dogs seemed to sense the tension, padding quietly through the halls instead of their usual cheerful trotting. Marcus remained at his post, but every fiber of his being was alert. 23 years of service had taught him that sometimes the greatest threats to those he was sworn to protect came not from foreign enemies or assassins, but from within the very walls he guarded. The irony was not lost on him that his ceremonial rifle, carried as a symbol of his readiness to defend the royal family against any threat, might today bear witness to a conflict between the very people he had sworn to protect. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air, giving the corridor an almost ethereal quality. In a few hours, the same hallway would be filled with the normal activities of castle life: courtiers seeking audiences, servants completing their duties, children playing in the spaces where children were allowed. But, right now, in this moment of tension, it felt like the entire castle was balanced on the edge of something irreversible. Marcus adjusted his grip on his rifle and continued his vigilant watch, unaware that within minutes, everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and moral courage would be tested in ways he had never imagined possible. The sounds from the morning room continued: Oliver's bright voice answering questions, Master Benedict's encouraging responses, and, underneath it all, the approaching sound of Queen Isabel's footsteps, each click of her heels marking time toward a moment that would change everything. The morning room of Castle Aldermere had always been Prince Oliver's favorite place for lessons. Large windows faced the eastern gardens, filling the space with natural light that danced across the polished wooden floors. Ancient tapestries depicting the victories of kings long dead hung on the walls, their golden threads catching and reflecting the sunlight. It was here that Oliver felt most like himself, not the formal prince required at state dinners, but simply a curious boy eager to learn about the world around him. Master Benedict had arranged their materials on the heavy oak table that had served as a classroom for generations of royal children. Maps of distant kingdoms, books bound in leather and gilt, writing instruments, and small wooden blocks for mathematics created an organized chaos that spoke of serious learning tempered with patience for a 7-year-old's attention span. The old tutor's approach had always been to make learning feel like discovery rather than duty, and Oliver responded to this with an enthusiasm that warmed the educator's heart. "Now then, Your Highness," Master Benedict said, his kind eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed spectacles, "can you show me on this map where our kingdom of Valethorn sits in relation to the Meridian Sea?" Oliver leaned forward eagerly, his small finger tracing the coastline with careful precision. "Here, Master Benedict. And, see, if you follow this blue line, that's the trade route that brings us silk and spices from the eastern kingdoms." His voice carried the excitement of a child who genuinely loved learning, each new piece of knowledge adding to an internal map of understanding that grew daily. "Excellent. Your father will be proud of how well you're mastering geography. Now, can you tell me why understanding these trade routes is important for a future king?" This was the kind of question that made Oliver think deeply, his young brow furrowing in concentration. Because a king needs to understand how his people make their living? If something happened to the trade routes, people might not have jobs, and, then, they couldn't buy food for their families. Master Benedict smiled broadly. The prince's capacity for empathy, even at his young age, suggested he would grow into a ruler who truly cared for his subjects. "That's exactly right, my boy. A wise king understands that his strength comes from his people's prosperity and happiness." Outside the morning room, Marcus continued his vigilant watch, but the peaceful sounds of learning had begun to relax his earlier tension. Perhaps his premonition had been wrong. Perhaps Queen Isabel's mood would pass without incident, as it sometimes did. The rhythmic cadence of Master Benedict's patient teaching and Oliver's eager responses created a soothing backdrop that almost made him forget the charged atmosphere from earlier. But the calm was shattered by the sharp sound of doors being thrown open with more force than necessary. Queen Isabel strode into the morning room, her burgundy gown billowing behind her like storm clouds. The letters she had been reading were now crumpled in her left hand, and her grey eyes burned with barely contained fury. Master Benedict immediately rose from his chair, offering a deep bow that Oliver quickly mimicked, though confusion was written clearly across the child's face. "Your Majesty," Master Benedict said carefully, "we weren't expecting. I need to speak with my son." Queen Isabel cut him off, her voice like ice cracking under pressure. "Alone." The elderly tutor hesitated for just a moment. In 40 years of teaching royal children, he had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when discretion was the better part of valor. The queen's posture, the way her free hand clenched and unclenched at her side, the tight line of her mouth, these were warning signs that wise servants heeded. "Of course, Your Majesty. Prince Oliver, we'll continue our lesson this afternoon." Master Benedict gathered his materials with efficient speed, pausing only to give Oliver an encouraging smile before bowing again and leaving the room. The heavy door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Oliver stood beside his chair, uncertain whether he should sit or remain standing, his young mind trying to process the tension radiating from his mother. At 7, he was old enough to recognize anger but not yet sophisticated enough to understand its complexities or predict its targets. "Mother," he said tentatively, his voice small in the large room. "Is everything well? You seem upset." Queen Isabel's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Upset? Oh, my dear child, upset is far too mild a word for what I am feeling right now." She moved to the windows, staring out at the gardens where servants tended flower beds with careful attention. "Your father's weakness is going to be the ruin of this kingdom, and, by extension, the ruin of your future." Oliver's confusion deepened. In his young world, his father was a figure of strength and wisdom, someone who lifted him high in the air and told him bedtime stories about brave knights and noble quests. The idea that his father could be weak was as foreign to him as the concept that water could flow upward. "I don't understand, Mother. Father isn't weak. Just yesterday he lifted me up to see the falcon's nest in the tower, and he didn't even seem tired." The innocence of the response only seemed to inflame Queen Isabel's anger further. She whirled around to face her son, the crumpled letters now trembling in her grasp. Physical strength means nothing when a man lacks the will to use the power of his position. Your father refuses to stand firm against the Northern Lord's demands for grain subsidies. He's more concerned with being loved than with being respected. The political complexities of kingdom management were far beyond Oliver's comprehension, but he could sense that this was important to his mother, that whatever was in those letters had caused her great distress. His natural response was to try to comfort her, to offer the simple affection that had always soothed hurt feelings in his young experience. "Maybe father has good reasons," Oliver said, taking a step closer to his mother. "He always explains things when I don't understand. Would you like me to ask him to explain to you too?" Outside the morning room, Marcus heard the conversation through the thick wooden door. Castle acoustics had a way of carrying voices, particularly when those voices were raised in anger. The queen's tone was escalating, and the prince's innocent attempts to mediate were clearly not having the calming effect the boy intended. Marcus felt his grip tighten on his rifle. 23 years of experience told him this situation was spiraling toward something unpleasant, but protocol and duty kept him at his post. Royal family arguments were not the business of guards, unless they became something more than arguments. Still, every paternal instinct in his body urged him to intervene, to find some excuse to enter the room and defuse whatever was building to a crescendo behind that door. Inside the morning room, Queen Isabel's control finally snapped. The suggestion that her son, a 7-year-old child, should act as mediator between his parents struck her as the final insult in a morning full of indignities. The Northern Lord's demands, her husband's weakness, and now her own son's naive faith in his father's wisdom all combined into a perfect storm of rage that needed an immediate target. "Don't you dare speak to me about your father's wisdom," she shouted, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "You're just a child. You understand nothing about what it means to rule, nothing about the sacrifices required to maintain power." Oliver instinctively stepped backward, tears beginning to form in his brown eyes. He had never seen his mother this angry before, had never been the target of such fury. His young mind couldn't process what he had done wrong or how his innocent suggestion had triggered such a violent response. "I'm sorry, Mother," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to make you angry. Please don't shout at me." The sight of her son's tears, rather than softening Queen Isabel's heart, seemed to intensify her rage. In her current state, she saw his crying not as natural childhood emotion but as manipulation, as weakness inherited from his father. Every sob felt like an accusation, every tear a reminder of her husband's gentle nature that she had come to despise. "Stop crying," she commanded, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Stop crying right now. Royal princes don't cry. Weak children cry, and I will not raise a weak son." But Oliver, overwhelmed by fear and confusion, could not simply turn off his tears. If anything, his mother's harsh words only made him cry harder, his small body shaking with sobs that he tried desperately to suppress but could not control. The morning room, which minutes before had been filled with the joy of learning, now echoed with the sounds of a child in distress and a mother consumed by rage that had found its target in the most innocent of victims. The sound that Marcus heard next would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was the sharp crack of an open palm striking tender flesh, followed immediately by a small cry of pain and shock that cut through the morning air like a blade. In 23 years of faithful service, through border wars and palace intrigue, Marcus had never felt his heart stop the way it did in that moment. Prince Oliver's cry wasn't just one of physical pain, though the sting of his mother's palm across his cheek certainly hurt. It was the sound of innocence shattering, of a child's fundamental trust in the world being broken in a single moment. The 7-year-old had never been struck before, had never experienced violence from someone who was supposed to love and protect him. His tears, which had been from confusion and fear, now became the desperate sobs of a child who no longer understood his place in the world. "I said stop crying." Queen Isabel's voice had reached a pitch that spoke of complete loss of control. The letters in her hand were now torn from her clenched grip, fragments of political correspondence scattered across the polished floor like fallen leaves. "You will learn to control yourself, or I will teach you control." Inside the morning room, Oliver stood frozen in shock, one small hand pressed against his burning cheek. The handprint was already visible, a red mark against his pale skin that would fade in time but leave scars that might never heal. His brown eyes, so like his father's, stared at his mother with an expression of betrayal so profound that it seemed to age him years in seconds. For Queen Isabel, seeing that look of hurt and confusion on her son's face should have been enough to shock her back to sanity. But the rage that had been building all morning, fed by political frustrations and personal disappointments, had reached a point where reason no longer held sway. Instead of maternal guilt, she felt only increased fury at Oliver's continued tears, interpreting them as defiance rather than the natural response of a frightened child. Outside the door, Marcus faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Protocol was clear: royal family disputes were not his concern unless they threatened the physical safety of his charges. But, was a mother striking her child truly a threat? Where was the line between family discipline and his duty to protect? The Queen was Oliver's parent, she had every legal right to discipline her son as she saw fit. Yet every instinct Marcus possessed as both a soldier and a man screamed that what was happening beyond that door was wrong. The sound of another strike reached his ears, followed by Oliver's heartbroken wail. This time, the boy hadn't just been slapped, he had been pushed backward, stumbling against the heavy table where his morning lessons had been so peacefully arranged just minutes before. Maps and books scattered as the prince tried to catch himself, his small hands scraping against the rough wood. "You will be strong," Queen Isabel shouted, advancing on her son like a predator stalking prey. "I will not allow you to become the weak fool your father is. Every kingdom watches us, waiting for signs of weakness, and I will not give them the satisfaction." Marcus's hands began to shake, a tremor that had nothing to do with age or infirmity and everything to do with the moral conflict tearing him apart. The rifle in his hands, carried for over 2 decades as a symbol of his oath to protect the royal family, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Who was the threat here? The Queen harming her son, or a guard who might dare to intervene in royal family business? Inside the room, Oliver had pressed himself against the far wall, as far from his mother as the space would allow. His lesson materials lay scattered around him, the careful organization of learning replaced by chaos. Blood from his scraped palms had left small marks on the papers Master Benedict had so carefully prepared. The morning sunlight that had seemed so cheerful earlier now illuminated a scene that belonged in nightmares rather than in a place of education. "Please, Mother," Oliver whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "I'll try to be stronger. I'll try not to cry. Please don't hit me anymore." The plea from her 7-year-old son should have been enough to break through Queen Isabel's rage. Any mother hearing her child beg for mercy should have felt her heart break, should have dropped to her knees to gather him in her arms and apologize for losing control. But the Queen's fury had reached a point where Oliver's words only reinforced her conviction that he needed to learn harsh lessons about strength and control. "Begging is weakness," she snarled, raising her hand again. "Royal blood doesn't beg. Stand up straight and face your punishment with dignity." But Oliver couldn't stand up straight. Fear had weakened his knees, and his small body trembled with shock and terror. At 7 years old, he possessed neither the physical strength nor the emotional maturity to meet his mother's impossible demands. He was simply a frightened child who wanted the hitting to stop, who wanted his mother to return to the person she had been before the morning's terrible transformation. Marcus heard the whisper of fabric and the intake of breath that preceded another blow. In that instant, 23 years of training and discipline warred with 23 years of moral development and human compassion. He thought of his own nephew, barely younger than Prince Oliver, and tried to imagine standing by while someone hurt that innocent child. He thought of his oath of service, sworn to protect the royal family from all threats, and wondered if that oath could possibly require him to protect the family from itself. The sound of Queen Isabel's hand striking Oliver for the third time shattered Marcus's paralysis. The prince's scream this time was different, deeper, more desperate, carrying a note of genuine fear for his physical safety. Whatever discipline this might have started as had clearly escalated beyond any reasonable bounds. Marcus could no longer tell himself this was simply a family matter beyond his concern. His decision was made in the space between heartbeats. 23 years of faithful service, of following orders without question, of maintaining proper protocol and respect for hierarchy, all of it crumbled in the face of a child's terrified cry. Marcus shouldered his rifle properly, adjusted his grip on the weapon that had been ceremonial for so long, and stepped toward the morning room door. The weight of the decision was staggering. He wasn't just choosing to intervene in a royal family dispute, he was choosing to potentially end his career, to violate every principle of military discipline he had ever been taught, to stand against the very authority he had sworn to serve. But, as another of Oliver's cries reached his ears, Marcus realized that some decisions transcended career concerns and military protocol. Some decisions were about what kind of man he was willing to be when faced with a choice between duty and conscience. His hand reached for the door handle, and, for the first time in over 2 decades, Sir Marcus Thornfield prepared to act against direct royal authority. The morning sun streaming through the corridor windows caught the metal of his rifle, and he wondered if these would be the last moments of his honored service to the crown. But, as Prince Oliver's sobbing continued from within the morning room, Marcus knew he would rather face court-martial than live with the knowledge that he had stood by and done nothing when a child needed protection. The door handle turned beneath his weathered hand, and Marcus stepped across the threshold that would change everything, not just for himself, but for everyone within the stone walls of Castle Aldermere. Behind him, the corridor that had witnessed centuries of royal history prepared to witness something unprecedented: a royal guard choosing to protect the royal family from itself, regardless of the cost to his own honor and future. The heavy wooden door of the morning room swung open with deliberate slowness, the ancient hinges creaking in a way that seemed to announce the arrival of judgment itself. Marcus entered not as the dutiful guard who had stood watch for 23 years, but as something far more dangerous: a man whose moral convictions had finally overridden his military training. The sight that greeted him would burn in his memory forever. Prince Oliver was pressed against the far wall, his small body trembling like a leaf in winter wind. His face bore the red marks of his mother's hand, and tears streamed down his cheeks in rivers of pure anguish. His lesson clothes, which had been neat and proper when the morning began, were now disheveled and torn at the sleeve where he had tried to shield himself. Most heartbreaking of all were his eyes, wide with terror and confusion, the trust that had always shone there now replaced with the desperate wariness of a hunted animal. Queen Isabel stood in the center of the room like an avenging fury, her burgundy gown wrinkled from her violent movements, her carefully arranged hair now wild with strands escaping their pins. Her face was flushed with exertion and rage, her gray eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to burn everything it touched. In her right hand, she held what appeared to be a wooden ruler she had snatched from Master Benedict's teaching supplies, raising it as if to deliver another blow to her cowering son. The contrast between the morning's earlier peace and this scene of domestic violence was so stark that for a moment Marcus wondered if he had stepped into some nightmare version of the castle he knew so well. The scattered papers and overturned books, the scratches on the wooden table where Oliver had tried to escape, the tear stains on ancient maps, all of it spoke to a violence that had no place in a room dedicated to learning and growth. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the terrible atmosphere with the authority of a man who had commanded troops in battle. "Step away from the prince." Queen Isabel whirled to face him, her eyes wide with shock and outrage at this unprecedented interruption. For 23 years, Marcus had been a fixture in the castle background, reliable and invisible as the stones themselves. To have him suddenly stand before her as an equal, daring to issue commands to royalty, was so unexpected that for a moment she could only stare in disbelief. "How dare you?" she finally managed, her voice rising to a shriek that echoed off the stone walls. "How dare you enter this room without permission? This is a private family matter, and you will remove yourself immediately." Marcus remained unmoved, his position between the queen and her son as deliberate as a fortress wall. His grip on his rifle had tightened, not in threat but in determination, the weight of the weapon serving as a reminder of his oath to protect those who could not protect themselves. Behind him, he could hear Oliver's labored breathing, the sound of a child trying desperately to stifle sobs that refused to be controlled. "I have served this family faithfully for over 2 decades, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was doing. "I have protected this house from foreign enemies and domestic threats. I will not stand by and watch harm come to those I have sworn to protect, regardless of the source of that threat." The implications of his words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything. Marcus was not just questioning Queen Isabel's actions, he was directly challenging her authority, placing his judgment above hers in a system where royal will was supposed to be absolute. It was tantamount to treason, and everyone in the room understood the gravity of the moment. Queen Isabel's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, disbelief, and, finally, a calculating coldness that was perhaps more dangerous than her earlier fury. "You forget yourself, guard. I am the Queen of Valethorn, and that child is my son. I will discipline him as I see fit, and no servant will dare to question my methods." "With respect, Your Majesty," Marcus said, though his tone suggested his respect had limits, "Prince Oliver is not your property to damage as you please. He is a child under the protection of this crown, and I am sworn to defend all members of this royal house from harm." Behind Marcus, Oliver had slowly begun to emerge from his terrified paralysis. The familiar voice of the guard who had always been kind to him, who had answered his questions and sometimes smiled when he thought no one was looking, penetrated through his fear. For the first time since the nightmare began, someone was standing between him and his mother's rage. Someone was fighting for him when he was too small and frightened to fight for himself. Queen Isabel's laugh was like breaking glass. "You fool! You have just destroyed your career, your reputation, everything you have worked for, all for the sake of preventing a mother from disciplining her child. When the king hears of this insubordination, when the king hears of this," Marcus interrupted, his voice gaining strength from his conviction, "he will hear the truth. He will learn that his son was beaten and terrorized while those sworn to protect him stood by and did nothing. Let him judge whether my actions were those of a faithful servant or a traitor." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, 2 adults locked in a battle of wills over questions of authority and conscience, but it was broken by the sound of small footsteps. Oliver, gathering courage from Marcus's protection, had begun to edge around the room toward the guard who had risked everything to defend him. "No!" Queen Isabel shrieked, her rage reigniting at the sight of her son seeking protection from someone other than her. "You will not turn my child against me." She raised the wooden ruler, her intent now focused not on Oliver but on Marcus himself, as if she could somehow strike down the challenge to her authority with physical force. It was in that moment that Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. As Queen Isabel moved toward him with the ruler raised, as Prince Oliver cowered behind him in terror, as 23 years of faithful service came crashing down around his ears, Marcus shouldered his rifle properly and pointed it directly at the woman he had sworn to protect. The sound of the weapon's movement cutting through air was impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Queen Isabel stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes fixed on the barrel that was now aimed at her heart. For the first time since her rage began, real fear entered her expression, the understanding that she was no longer in control of the situation, that the natural order of the castle had been completely overturned. "Drop the ruler," Marcus commanded, his voice now carrying the authority of an armed man rather than a deferential servant. "Step back from the prince. This ends now." The morning room, which had begun the day as a place of learning and discovery, had been transformed into a battlefield where concepts of loyalty, duty, and moral courage clashed like armies in the night. Outside the windows, the gardens of Castle Aldermere continued their peaceful existence, unaware that within the stone walls, the foundations of everything the kingdom stood for were being tested by one man's decision to choose protecting innocence over protecting authority. In the terrible silence that followed Marcus's ultimatum, 3 people stood frozen in a tableau that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis passed. A queen who had learned that absolute power has absolute limits when confronted by absolute conviction. A guard who had discovered that true loyalty sometimes requires the ultimate betrayal of those you serve. And a 7-year-old prince who had learned that sometimes heroes emerge not from stories and legends, but from ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when the innocent need protection. The weight of the rifle in Marcus's hands had never felt heavier, and the burden of his decision would follow him for the rest of his days. But, as Prince Oliver's quiet sobbing gradually began to calm behind him, Marcus knew that whatever consequences awaited him, he had finally acted in accordance with the deepest principles of the oath he had taken so many years ago to protect those who could not protect themselves, regardless of the cost to himself. The tableau in the morning room held for what felt like an eternity, though it could have been no more than seconds. Queen Isabel stood frozen, the wooden ruler still raised but now trembling in her grasp, her gray eyes fixed on the rifle barrel that remained steadily pointed at her heart. Marcus maintained his position with the calm determination of a man who had passed beyond fear into a realm where only principle mattered. Behind him, Prince Oliver's sobs had quieted to hitching breaths as he pressed himself against the guard's legs, finding safety in the shadow of someone who had chosen to risk everything for his protection. The sound that broke the terrible silence came from the corridor outside, running footsteps, multiple voices raised in alarm, the unmistakable commotion of a castle in crisis. Word had spread with the speed that only palace gossip could achieve. A royal guard holding the queen at gunpoint was the kind of news that brought every courtier, servant, and official running to witness history in the making. King Edmund Valethorn arrived first, his usually composed face flushed from running and etched with a confusion that spoke to how unprecedented this situation truly was. Behind him came Lord Ashford, Master Benedict, Captain Reynolds of the Castle Guard, and a handful of other officials whose duties had brought them within earshot of the unfolding crisis. They gathered in the doorway like spectators at a theatrical performance, none quite sure whether to enter or flee from what they were witnessing. "Marcus," King Edmund said, his voice carrying both authority and bewilderment, "what in God's name is happening here?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, waiting to be burned away by the harsh light of truth. Marcus felt the weight of every eye upon him, the judgment of men who had respected him for over 2 decades now uncertain whether they were looking at a hero or a madman. His rifle remained steady, but he turned his head slightly to address his king while keeping Queen Isabel in his line of sight. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the room with the clarity of a man who had found peace in his convictions, "I discovered Queen Isabel striking Prince Oliver repeatedly. When I attempted to intervene, she threatened to continue the assault. I acted to protect your son from immediate physical harm." A collective intake of breath came from the assembled witnesses. Queen Isabel's face cycled through rage, humiliation, and calculation as she realized that her actions were now public knowledge, subject to the scrutiny of the very court she sought to impress with her strength and authority. "He lies," she finally managed, her voice shrill with desperation. "This insubordinate dog burst into a private family moment and threatened me with violence. I was merely correcting my son's behavior, as is my right as his mother and your queen." King Edmund's gaze shifted to his son, and what he saw there told him more than any testimony could. Oliver's tear-stained face, the red handprints still visible on his pale cheek, the way he clung to Marcus as if the guard were his only anchor in a storm, all of it painted a picture that made the king's heart clench with paternal fury and guilt. "Oliver," the king said gently, kneeling to bring himself to his son's level, "are you hurt? Tell me the truth, my boy." The 7-year-old prince looked between his father and his mother, his young mind struggling to understand the adult complexities swirling around him. But the pain was real, the fear was real, and the memory of his mother's violence was too fresh to deny. "She hit me, father," Oliver whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the absolute silence of the room. "I was crying because she was shouting, and she said royal princes don't cry, and then she hit me again and again. Sir Marcus stopped her from hitting me more." The simple, honest words of a child cut through the political complexities and legal questions like a sword through silk. There could be no debate about interpretations or motivations when the evidence was written in red marks across a little boy's face. King Edmund rose slowly, his expression transforming from confusion to a cold fury that made even veteran courtiers step backward. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute royal authority, the kind of tone that had once commanded armies and now commanded a kingdom. "Isabel," he said, addressing his queen with a formality that spoke volumes about the death of their marriage, "you will return to your chambers immediately. You are confined there until further notice. Guards will be posted to ensure you do not leave or receive visitors without my express permission." Queen Isabel's composure finally shattered completely. "You cannot do this to me. I am Queen of Valethorn. I will not be imprisoned for disciplining my own child." "You are Queen of Valethorn by marriage to me," Edmund replied with icy precision, "and you will remain so only as long as I permit it. What you did to our son was not discipline, it was cruelty, and I will not allow it to continue." The threat of divorce hung unspoken in the air, a political catastrophe that would shake the kingdom to its foundations but which seemed inevitable given what had transpired. Queen Isabel seemed to realize this, her face going pale as the full consequences of her morning's actions began to dawn on her. Marcus, meanwhile, slowly lowered his rifle as Captain Reynolds stepped forward with 2 guards to escort the queen from the room. The crisis was ending, but he knew his own fate remained uncertain. He had pointed a weapon at the queen, had defied royal authority in the most dramatic way possible, and, regardless of his motivations, such actions demanded consequences. King Edmund turned to face him, and, for a moment Marcus saw not his sovereign but a father grateful to the man who had protected his child. "Sir Marcus Thornfield," the king said formally, "you have served this house with honor for 23 years. Today you served it with a courage that transcends duty." The relief that flooded through Marcus was tempered by uncertainty. "Your Majesty, I understand that my actions may require your actions," the king interrupted, "were those of a man who remembered that our first duty is always to protect the innocent, regardless of their station or our own. You will face no punishment for what you did here today. Instead, you have my eternal gratitude and that of every decent person in this kingdom." Master Benedict stepped forward, kneeling beside Prince Oliver and speaking in the gentle voice that had comforted generations of royal children. "Your Highness, would you like to continue your lessons? We could perhaps read some stories about brave knights instead of mathematics today." Oliver nodded eagerly, his resilience already beginning to assert itself with the remarkable recuperative power of childhood. But he looked back at Marcus with an expression of hero worship that would follow the guard for the rest of his days. As Queen Isabel was escorted from the room, her departure marked the end of more than just a morning's crisis. The balance of power in Castle Aldermere had shifted permanently. A queen who had ruled through intimidation and fear had learned that there were limits to absolute authority when it conflicted with basic human decency. A king had been reminded that protecting his family meant more than political alliances and dynastic considerations. And Marcus Thornfield, who had entered the morning as a dutiful guard following orders without question, emerged as something far more significant, a man who had proven that true loyalty sometimes requires the courage to stand against the very authority you serve when that authority loses its way. The afternoon sun streamed through the morning room windows, illuminating a space that was being restored to its proper purpose as a place of learning and growth. The scattered papers were being gathered, the overturned books returned to their places, the physical evidence of the morning's violence slowly erased. But the emotional and political reverberations of what had transpired would echo through Castle Aldermere for years to come. Prince Oliver, his lessons resumed under Master Benedict's patient guidance, occasionally glanced toward the door where Marcus had returned to his post. The guard stood as he always had, rifle at the ready, eyes alert for any threat to those he protected. But now there was a difference in his bearing, a quiet pride that came from knowing he had acted with honor when it mattered most. In the corridors of Castle Aldermere, servants whispered the story that would become legend the day a royal guard chose conscience over protocol, protection over politics, and proved that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the willingness to stand against those you serve when they forget what they truly stand for. Sir Marcus Thornfield had risked everything to save a child, and, in doing so, had saved something far more precious, the very soul of the kingdom he had sworn to protect.